Hello everyone, today I'll be reviewing the Kalam Kohaku. Now, I don't have a real Kohaku to compare, but I do have some real parts to put in this. First, let's talk about the finish quality. I think it's good, but nothing extraordinary. I'm comparing it to my Singa plate here, and it doesn't feel as smooth as the ano on the Singa plate. Nor does it feel as smooth as the ano on Neo boards, like my Neo 75. But compared to the Singa plate, the Kalam ano is just a little bit rougher, and it is, if you look at the color, it's a tiny bit lighter. So the real plate, you see it's a little bit darker. It's a very nice looking black, while the Kalam looks a little grayish. And the way I describe the feel is that it's like a very smooth chalkboard, in that when you run your nails on it, it just makes me cringe. It's not, yeah, you can see marks. You can just wipe it right off. So yeah, it just feels like a chalkboard, and it's not the best ano, but it's acceptable. Now, let's talk about what sets the Kalam Kohaku apart from the real Kohaku. I would say that would be its price. When the Kalam Kohaku R2 ran, the starting price, I believe, was around $350 US, not including shipping. But now, if you want to join in on a group buy, it's more like a pre-order right now. It's about $400 for this configuration, but getting them on aftermarket is also around $400. The retail price of the Singa Kohaku is about $560, but right now you can only get them in the aftermarket, which ranges from $1,000 to $1,300, and that's a pretty big difference. I don't think that the difference in ano quality between this and my Singa plate is worth $600, $700 more. So I had a pretty okay build experience with this, but there was a few issues. So the Kalam PCB, I'm using a hot swap one, and the sockets are very, very tight. I'm not sure if it's the sockets or it's the holes where the 2 extra pins go into. It's just very, very tight. And I almost broke the switch trying to get it out. And I didn't have these issues with the Kalam Unicorn Daisy hot swap PCB, but I did have issues with this one. And getting the switches in was no problem, but getting it out required some effort. And then to build this, you can see I already have a force broken, and you just put the PCB assembly on here, and there's no alignment pins or anything. You just have to align it yourself, just eyeball it. And then to install the top case, I found that it is best to keep the screws in the hole first, and then go from, like, you gotta be very careful because you can easily scratch the inside of your top case, and make sure that it is, yeah, see, so sometimes I just have some issues because the switch here is blocking this, I'm pretty sure, or something else. It just doesn't let me press the top case in perfectly. And then it took a few tries, and I had to like wiggle it around. So it's not the best experience putting the top case on, but I think that's a fault of Singa's design rather than Kalam messing some tolerances up. I'm just not that big of a fan of the hidden screw design that they do. It's a bit finicky, but like screwing it in, one thing I suggest is to put some tape around your screwdriver so you don't accidentally scratch your case. And then screw it in on the corners. I mean, there only are corners, but like screw in the opposite screws first. And then gradually tighten them all a little by little. And then another thing is to, you have to try to center the PCB yourself. Because when you don't center it, down here, you'll see a very ugly gap between the bottom row and the case. And to center it is just, you loosen the screws, and then you just move the PCB assembly back and forth. And then you can eyeball it and like try to center it, to center it. But if you don't want to see that gap at all, you can just move the entire PCB down. So this is what I mean. You can sort of move the PCB assembly like this, back and forth. If you misalign it, it will lead to an ugly gap on this corner and then no gap over here. It'll look lopsided, which is very ugly. So yeah, not a fault of Kalam, just a fault of the board's design, but it isn't a deal breaker. You just have to be a little patient and align your PCB assembly correctly. Note that if your PCB is not aligned perfectly in the middle, it can be kind of hard to take off the keycaps. For example, I have some trouble with this control key down here. If this is touching the bottom, then it's going to be kind of hard for you to get your keycap removal tool in there without scraping the case. So I use this Gateron keycap puller because it's made of plastic, and I have to like nudge the keycap up a little in order to wedge it in there and take it out. If you're using a metal keycap puller, please note that if you don't center your PCB assembly, then trying to take off the keycaps in the corners might damage your case. So next, let's compare the Kalam gaskets and the Singa gaskets, because I've heard a lot about how the R1 Kalam Kohaku had gaskets that were too soft or something. And these are definitely, they feel very similar to the Singa gaskets. These are Kalam, these are Singa. They feel almost identical. But the Kalam gaskets are a tiny bit taller. You can tell from here, it's just a smidge taller. And I measure with my calipers. The Singa gaskets are a very weird height. It's 2.5 millimeters. The Kalam is a more standard 3 millimeter height. And having gaskets on the top and bottom case, that's a difference of 1 millimeter. And that might not seem like much, but it causes the Kalam gaskets to be very compressed when you insert it into the plate, and that could potentially lead to a sound difference. And another thing was when I was building it, because the bottom gaskets were a bit taller, the USB port would not line up. And I had to fit the USB port into the recessed cutout, but I couldn't because it was sitting too high. So I had to compress the entire PCB assembly down and put pressure on the USB-C port. And that is not a very good thing for the USB-C port. It can potentially snap off if you put enough pressure on it. I recommend you get the real gaskets. Now, let's talk about feet. So these two are the genuine Singa feet. These bumpons are 8 millimeters by 3 millimeters. This is the Kalam bumpon. It's 8 millimeters by 2 millimeters. So it's 1 millimeter short. And then these are some bumpons that I found on AliExpress. These are 8 by 2 millimeters, I believe. These are 8 by 3 millimeters. This is 8 by 4. And then this is 8 by 3. And the bumpons will change the sound of your keyboard. And something I noticed is that the genuine Singa black ones are slightly softer than the Singa clear ones. And that could potentially lead to a difference in sound, which you will hear in the sound tests. And the black Singa ones are identical, like straight up identical to these ones that I found from AliExpress. But I couldn't find one on AliExpress that has the same stiffness as the clear ones from Singa. And for the rest of this video, in the sound test, I'll be using clear 8 by 3 millimeter bumpons from AliExpress. And they feel about the same stiffness as the Singa black bumpons. So I forgot to do a comparison with the Singa bumpons, but I put them on and they sound the exact same as the AliExpress black 3 millimeter ones. Okay, so thoughts on the bumpons? I haven't actually watched the recordings yet, but in person, I could barely tell a difference between them. There was a difference for the 4 millimeters. The 4 millimeters sort of made it more airy. It took away a little bit of desk resonance, even with using the desk mat. And especially on my desk, it got rid of a lot of desk resonance. So it sounded more airy, but also sounded a little bit thin. So I didn't really like that. Comparing the Kalam gasket, the Kalam feet to the other ones, I honestly don't think the Kalam ones sounded bad. It didn't sound thuddy like the stock gaskets did on the Kalam Unicorn. So if you don't care about like gaskets changing the front height and stuff, I think it's okay to just stick with the stock bumpons. Let's talk about force break. Some people received their units and noticed that there was some ping or hollowness. And although I didn't have any, here is how I would force break your board. So I would take some really thin tape. I'm sure masking tape would work, but I would go as thin as possible. And then I would put it on these areas where the top case comes into contact with the bottom case. And then I would make sure to go over on the edge a little, because this top case would scrape against the bottom case and make this very nasty metal noise. And then to prevent damaging your top case, you would make sure that there's some tape in between it. And this is how I would force break. Now, I don't know if you guys heard a difference, but in person, I feel like there was a difference in sound between force brake and no force brake, specifically on the mods. I feel like they just sound more popular, but that could be entirely placebo. All right, now let's move on to gaskets. Previously, for all my sound tests, I've been using the Kalam stock gaskets, but now I'm going to switch it up with the genuine gaskets, and then I'm going to compare the Kalam plate to some aftermarket aluminum plates. Now, here are my thoughts between the Kalam and Singa gaskets. I think that this board is designed around using gaskets of this thickness, and the Kalam gaskets being slightly taller just makes the build experience a little worse. For example, again, the USB-C port is misaligned when you first try to screw on the top case. And then when you put the top case on with the Kalam gasket, since they're taller by 1 millimeter, you have to like squish or push the top case down and compress those gaskets before you start screwing in. With the Singa ones, the plate just rests there, and once you put on the top case, it's basically flush with the bottom, and you don't have to push down at all. So I would recommend getting the Singa gaskets, but does it sound $20 better than the Kalam? $20 is how much I paid for these gaskets, including shipping. Is it worth that money? I don't think so. I don't think it sounds any better than the Kalam gaskets. In fact, I think it sounds a little bit worse. It introduced a little bit of resonance that I wasn't hearing with the Kalam gaskets. And the Kalam gaskets were deeper. And that's totally your preference if you like that kind of sound or not. You just have to make your own opinion from the sound tests that I have. But I still think it sounds great. It feels more bouncy, and it makes the build experience better, which is why I'll be keeping the Singa gaskets on this. But yeah, that's my comparison between the Kalam and Singa gaskets. All right, now let's talk about plates. People say that the Kalam plate sounds terrible. I do not agree. I think this, in this current config, sounds amazing. I don't hear significant resonance. But some will still claim that the Singa plate sounds better, so I'm going to be doing a comparison. I haven't done it yet, but here are the plates I'll be comparing it against. These are all aluminum plates. Right now, my Kalam plate is installed in my board, but I have this plate, which I got from AliExpress, from Keybox, something like that. It costed me around $16. Here is a custom-made plate that does not have the leaf spring. So I'm curious how it would sound without the leaf spring. And then here is the Singa plate. Now, I would like to rant a little about the Singa plate. This costed me about $50, and it was not very good at first. If you aren't aware, Singa released a few plates that had an issue, a miscut issue at the bottom row. The left Alt and left Windows key for my plate was misaligned on the PCB. It caused it to tilt this way, and it creates a gap between the keys. And if you look at it like this, you can see the keycap is just tilted just a tiny bit. But once you look at it, once you notice it, you can never unnotice it. So what I had to do was I had to sand my plate. See here? Ignore this. Ignore these parts. But these two slots, I had to sand it down so that there was enough clearance for my key to not be pushed by the plate and tilt. So that was not a good experience. I do not have that with my Kalam plate. As you can see, perfectly flat keys. So if you're looking to buy an aftermarket Singa plate, be aware that Singa will not replace these plates for you, okay? You will not be covered by their support. All they're gonna tell you to do is just sand your switch or sand your plate. So be prepared to do that if you buy an aftermarket Singa plate. I think that all the aluminum plates sound very similar to each other, and the only plate that really stood out from the rest was carbon fiber. And maybe the custom cut no leaf spring plate was a bit unique, but I didn't like the sound signature of that, so I'm gonna be selling it. And I don't think you need to get a genuine Singa plate. In fact, I noticed a difference between the genuine Singa and the Kalam, but I don't think it is better. In fact, I prefer the Kalam plate over the Singa plate because it's just louder and isn't as muted. The spacebar just pops way louder and it just sounds more lively than the Singa plate. And also, I think the AliExpress plate was pretty much just as good as the Singa one in terms of sound. So yeah, I don't recommend having to buy a Singa plate and then sand it down, but you guys do you. If you like it, then you can get one. And overall thoughts of the board, I'm very satisfied with it. I think it is pretty good. With all the stock stuff like the stock gaskets, stock feet, but it does have some weaknesses like the gaskets not being short enough and the anodization quality being pretty bad and it feeling like a chalkboard. I don't enjoy that. Also, the color isn't very accurate. It's not as dark as the original is. And other than that, I think it's great. Honestly, if I owned a real Kohaku, I would go out of my way to buy a Kalam plate because I just think it sounds better. Yeah.